let's start by discussing approaches to data mapping and potential quality issues related to claims data specifically. Lax, what should payers consider before starting on a mapping exercise?
Sure, sure. I think they should understand the scope of this mandate from a claims data set perspective. So specifically from a patient access API, the scope is medical and pharmacy claims. And within medical claims, the scope is the inpatient and outpatient facility and professional claims. So when we talk about the claims data, so the system QNext is predominantly used for managing medical claims versus there are ancillary systems that could manage the pharmacy claims.
So what does this process for mapping this medical claims data look like?
Sure. So when from a solution provider perspective, right, we look at this this whole mapping exercise as a process to harmonize the vocabulary and the code sets between two systems, the source system being QNext and the target system being the FHIR repository. So we look at this as a two-step process. The first step is to take the QNext claims vocabulary and then map it to an intermediary format, which is called CPCDS, or Common Payer Consumer Data Set. That's the first step. The second step is to take the CPCDS format and convert that to a FHIR resource. When it comes to guidance on these two steps mapping, the guidance around converting CPCDS to FHIR is guided by the Karen Blue Button implementation guides, versus the first step where we talk about mapping from QNext to CPCDS. That's where the heavy lift or the nuance is all about. So now we have Brian in our with us who is deeply immersed in this QNext system. And Brian, so what do you think about some of the challenges in coming up with the mapping between QNext and this CPCDS format?
Well, Lax, of course, every core administration system has its own data model. The good thing about QNext is it's been built to have an easy to understand data model. So the basic information is going to need to end up in the FHIR data repository. About 80% of that is going to be pretty easily reachable via claims and claim detail tables, for example. You start to get a little more complicated when you get into the referral tables for authorization, utilization management, and some of those things. But it should be a relatively straightforward exercise for most of the data that's required.
Thanks, Brian. Great to hear that the majority of the data should be easy to map. Have you seen anything related to the data availability that might raise concerns related directly to interoperability via QNext?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the areas that's going to be a problem potentially is the provider data. And that's just complexity in the structure of how it's stored within QNext. You have a single provider record with multiple affiliations to other providers, and you have to find the right ones. So it can be really a challenge in that area.
So what does this mean for complexities related to the quality of the data?
So the quality of the data, and interestingly, the provider data tends to be the hardest to keep clean, to get and keep clean for payers. There's a lot of times where you have duplicate or missing NPI numbers, for example. So taking the time to kind of clean some of that data up prior to doing this exercise would probably be good. And I would say that most payers are probably, that's probably a project they've been thinking about for a while.
Great, thanks for sharing those potential quality issues with us and maybe some of that front end work. Lex, can you shed some light on how to potentially automate and operationalize these mappings from a system perspective?
Sure. So when we look at this mapping, right? The mapping are logical grouping of data classes that QNext has. So we don't expect QNext to provide us one big file which has all the claim and its related data. The extraction of data from QNext is going to reflect the system, the structure of the system in QNext. So what it really means is there are going to be multiple files that are going to be provided as part of the export of claims from QNext. This could be around the master claims, or claim details, or recipients, or coverage, or provider. So we expect that there are multiple files that are going to come out of QNext as part of the extract. Similarly, when we do the mapping to CPCDS, CPCDS also has logical groups in which these mappings happens. So there is CPCDS. There are this claims. There is this coverage, members, organizations, and practitioners. So the mapping essentially is the mapping between these groups of data elements, right? Um, so from a system perspective, the mapping is written in such a way that these individual files are mapped and eventually mapped to a target FHIR resource. The FHIR resources that are impacted, that are populated at the end of this mapping, are explanation of benefits in resources for inpatient and outpatient, and for EOB, and for professional as well. And in addition to this, from a patient access API perspective, the other FHIR resources are explanation of benefits for pharmacy and coverage and patient.
So once this mapping takes place, how does the payer test conformance for the standard API for patient and population services data?
Awesome, that's a great question. So when we look at the conformance, right, there are multiple approaches in the conformance we see in the market. From a solution provider perspective, we recommend that the once you create a FHIR resource, you make sure that the FHIR resource is conformant to the FHIR specification and to the implementation guide specifications before you load the data into the repository. And that's one approach. There are other approaches where after you load the data into the repository, you use external tools like the one from the healthit.gov, which is in for now, which will help you to evaluate the conformance of that particular resource against a set of specifications.
Great. So we've talked with Lex and Brian about the data mapping and data quality issues related to claims data in particular. Lots of information here. Lex, in conclusion, what would you say are the key takeaways for payers as they begin to make their claims data compliant under the interoperability mandate?
Sure. So as as we saw some of the nuances or approaches outlined by Brian from mapping from QNext to the FHIR to the FHIR mappings. As we do these mappings, what we suggest would be to align these mapping closely with the implementation guides, right? That's primarily because the implementation guides goes through a process where they understand what elements might be there in the future or what elements might be deprecated. So based on that, there are business rules around what element of FHIR resources needs to be populated for a certain context. So we recommend that that as payers take up this task of mapping, align closely with the business rules that are outlined in the implementation guide, right? So that's our first takeaway. The second would be as payers look at this end-to-end solutions, we look at they need to look at tools that these solutions offers, which are quick starters. For example, there could be some reference mappings for their source systems. In the case of QNext, in the context of Hailfire, we have a reference mapping from QNext, which could be used as a startup. And then, of course, the nuances in terms of filling in those gaps happens. So that's a great accelerator for the payer. Subsequent to that, there could be the solution also needs to have this configurable data ingestion pipeline. What this really means is you should be able to configure this data validation, data conformance, and the loading process so that the configuration reflects a mitigation approach around the availability and the quality issues that you have in your source system, right? And finally, the solution also needs to have capabilities to bulk load the data, because you're looking at volumes and volumes of claims. So you should be able to have tools or accelerators that help you to load that volume of data.